Welcome to this episode of Who Gives a Vote, where we discuss all things politics and some other things along the way. All the views expressed in this podcast are personal views and do not reflect the views of any organisation or entity that the participants may be involved with. So let's get started. Welcome to another episode of Who Gives a Vote. We have George, David and Carly and myself, Stuart, excited about a topic. Well, at least I'm excited about it. George, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
We did promise we're going to talk about the Torquay Caravan Park.
Yeah, I've come all prepared for the Torquay Caravan Park.
Well, if we get through the first topic, we can smash out the next one. What do you reckon?
Okay.
David,
I feel like by the looks of that piece of paper that he's going to need a whole episode.
Yes. This is the results of the community consultation, record-breaking community consultation on Torquay Caravan Park.
So the Torquay Caravan Park, which is scheduled for a vote on next Wednesday.
Next Wednesday,
so
yeah.
6 days away.
Yeah.
What is actually, what is, do you know what the resolution of the vote will be?
Well, there's a recommendation that council receive and note the report and to resume the redevelopment of the Torquay Caravan Park utilising the current park design.
Spending billions and billions of dollars.
About 9 million.
Oh, okay, yeah. Sounds better when I say it like that. Dave, what do you reckon? Do you want to talk about Torquay Caravan Park?
Look, I don't mind. I'm happy to talk about Torquay Caravan Park. I mean, my knowledge of Torquay Caravan Park is probably slightly less than my knowledge of the youth justice issues, but we could touch on it quickly.
Yeah, it's what's the adult time for adult crime? The beautiful slogans that the current government are coming up with. I'm very keen to talk about some of those issues. Carly, what do you reckon?
I wouldn't say that I'm excited, and that's because it's such a serious subject and it affects a lot of families, particularly vulnerable families. So, yeah.
Absolutely, and I guess that's where whether I'm excited or agitated, I'll try and calm myself down. Obviously, we often talk about the fact that we have to declare our conflicts of interest. I would have to say that I have to declare that I'm not a fan of this. I'm not a fan of these changes. I'm not a fan of using politics. Good politics doesn't necessarily lead to good law, but I don't want to preempt anyone else's view on these matters. So I'm pretty keen to get into this just as a way of introduction. And again, these are some of the things that I'm pretty keen to talk about. So I'll give you a quick rundown on what I'm thinking. And then if you want to add anything into that, we can do that as well. So obviously the big talking point is adult crime, adult time, and the changes to legislation through the reading of the bill last year in 2024 and then the amendment again last month, which is making communities safe. Is it the Making Communities Safe bill? Making Communities Safer bill. So they're already safe, but they're just a little bit safer, which is a great title, not necessarily good legislation. And part of that was amendments to the Youth Justice Act, the Criminal Code, and a range of other acts that align or relate to young offenders or young people, because young people offend doesn't mean they're necessarily going to go on and have a life of offending. So you've got that adult crime, adult time. The next part I wanted to talk about was, and these are the issues that I've pulled out, which is detention as a last resort being taken out of legislation. And then the ability to reference juvenile criminal history even into the adulthood, which is completely different to anything that I've ever experienced before. And then the overriding principles of the Human Rights Act and the fact that this legislation is in defiance of the Human Rights Act, but we have legislation that allows that to happen. Anyone else want to add any other issue to the table?
I guess just generally with it, I mean, I think when you're dealing with children before the courts, the idea should always, there's a lot of things at play. There's the punishment. There is, you want to address a disincentive for other people to do the wrong thing, but also you want to get that young person normalized back into society as a, healthy, active, productive, good citizen. And I'm not sure if this act looks at it from all those angles. It certainly looks at it from punishing them. But in terms of providing a disincentive, I don't think it does that adequately. I've always found, from a criminologist perspective or psychology, that it's a fear of getting, the chance of getting caught more so than the actual potential penalty that is this disincentive. I think they could do more for that. And then, of course, this goes backwards in terms of helping young people to get reintegrated into society.
Absolutely. Anything you want to add on to that, David? Or
Oh, look, I'm sure we can find enough things to weave in around there, and anything that I've got in mind that isn't on your agenda, I'll slide in anyway.
absolutely.
I'm in no way qualified or experienced to really make a comment other than from a layperson's point of view. But going from what George said, kids aren't taking the consequences into account already. Have they got enough frontal lobe to really go? Has it developed enough for them to go, oh, I'm going to spend my life in prison, when they're already doing things that are violent, unsafe, driving? Is that really going to be a disincentive when they're already taking risks?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, or is the increase from 3 years to 7 years going to be on the top of mind of a child?
Of a
who's,
child
who's
been
hungry?
egged on by some friends or...
That's a really interesting point, isn't it? I was thinking about it this afternoon. We all know about that tragic case in Maryborough where 3 people were killed, and the perpetrator, who I think pleaded guilty, was a child of 13 or 14. I won't say too much about it because I think it's still under appeal as to sentence, but one of the things that struck me there in terms of this idea that getting tougher will be a general deterrent to youth and other crime is simply, if you think about it, that kid, when he set out to steal a car, he intended to steal a car, and when he set out to drive fast, he intended to drive fast. But when he had that terrible accident, he didn't intend to have that terrible accident. And so a deterrence for that kind of crime, if his mind ever turned to it, and wouldn't have ever turned to the idea that that he might cause, that he might end up in prison over that sort of conduct, it wasn't an event he anticipated, and he didn't have the maturity to realise that it was a likely consequence. Yeah. And so the whole idea of somebody else getting a much more severe sentence would have been totally irrelevant to that set of conduct.
Except it includes stealing a vehicle.
Yes, that's right. And as I say, he intended that, but he wouldn't have intended the crash with,
or murder.
With the dreadful consequences it had.
So let's go in to have a look at some of these changes to the penalties. So we'll have a look at the offence, the previous penalty and the new penalty under the Act. So if you can see here, going armed in public, 1 to 5 years was the previous, now it's 2 to 3. Threatening violence has moved up to 2 to 5 years. Attempted murder is from 10 years, and then you've got rape, life imprisonment, attempted rape, 14 years. Assault and aggravated sexual assault increased to 14 years. You've got torture increased to 14 years. Damaging emergency vehicle, 14 years, which is these are the ones, endangering a police officer in a vehicle, 14 years. You've got stealing a firearm, 14 years. Aggravated attempted robbery, 14 years. Arson, life imprisonment. Endangering property by fire, 14 years. Then you've got kidnapping, 7 years. Kidnapping for ransom, 7 to 14. Deprivation of liberty, 3 years. Trafficking, dangerous drugs, life imprisonment. So when you look at those, the stark thing that sort of comes out to me, and it's important that when David Christopher earlier this month said, there's more to come. So we already know that the big items that people can relate to, if you murder someone, well, you should be punished. If you rape someone, you should. You can justify or explain those, particularly when there's the victims. But then when you have drug offences, you have offences relating to vehicles, like you said, and you increase them significantly, then what else are we going to have? What other offences are going to be part of this adult crime, adult time concept? I'm not sure that you can mount the same argument for murder as you can for a kid that decides to joyride in a vehicle and potentially bangs into another police vehicle, for example, which happened many times when I was a police officer. That activity happened. So I'm not certain that this type of legislation prevents, helps or assists a child in restoring them back into the community. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I would say that. But, prevention and intervention isn't as catchy of a line as adult crime, adult time.
Well, I don't know, but it works better.
Yeah, the experts seem to be suggesting that if you increase incarceration rates, then what you may get a short drop in the crime statistics simply because people aren't able to commit crime when they're in prison. But that washes through fairly quickly, and you end up with the same number of people back in the community, but far less equipped to
deal with
it and to deal with the regular life. The other aspect, I suppose, that one of the fundamental aspects is the huge cost, the huge diversion of funds which comes about once you start doing that. There's some statistics in it. I picked up a book at the Adelaide Writers' Week with one of the speakers down there was a criminologist, and one of his statistics he quotes is that from 1985 to 2017 there was a 130% increase across Australia of incarceration rates, numbers of people in prison, and we're now at something like 200 people per 100,000, over 200. That's adults. The cost, I haven't seen later statistics, but the figure sticks in my head is the cost of keeping a prisoner, child or adult, more so children, is something like over 200,000 a year. Now, every extra child you put in for an extra year costs the budget 200,000, which is 200,000 you can't spend on police or social workers or teachers or whatever you might need.
Well, I read today that they've got 3 detention centres in Queensland, and they're building a 4th, which has got a price tag of $1 billion on it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, David, what is the book that you were referring to then?
Oh, this is a book by a bloke called Rick Sarr, who was a criminologist in South Australia. It was interesting because at the speech that he gave at the Writers' Week, he was very critical of the politicians, and then they called for questions, and the first bloke who lined up was a former cabinet minister from South Australia who'd been responsible for youth justice, who was pretty incensed at what he'd had to say, but they did agree on a lot of things.
So the Youth Advocacy Centre put a submission in relation to these changes, and one of the quotes that really stood out to me was that the bill may lead to sentences for children which are more punitive than necessary. Does anyone want to comment on that? Do you agree with that?
Yeah, well, I think that's undoubtedly the case. It'll be interesting to see what the statistics show, as we move on. You can't really tell from 12 months or so of experimentation, but it's trying to clobber the problem from the far end of it, in a sense, isn't it? It's not sort of saying, how can we ensure that fewer and fewer youth offend? It's saying, well, let's try to see whether we can solve the problem by being really tough on those who do, and in effect abandoning them, I suspect. I mean, to be fair to the government, it's talking about additional support services and so on as well. Not across the fine detail of what they're doing on the ground.
Well, they're talking about rehabilitation after the 20 years in prison.
Yeah, that's right.
They're not talking about the
Staying on Track program, 12 months.
The prehabilitation, the prepare, like getting people right, dealing with the systemic issues, homelessness, dealing with domestic violence, dealing with hungry children, dealing with children who don't have effective role models. The money that can go into that, which is far more effective in dealing with youth crime than punishing a child. And it's interesting that when the state government refers to this and they say that it's been done in other places previously to this government doing it, they're happy to refer to those places, whether it be, in other countries or in the Northern Territory, in some ways in New South Wales, but slightly different offences. And they're very happy to say that other places have done it, but never rely on the results or the outcomes that have been achieved from those areas.
Yeah,
So
there's
if
no
it's been
results.
done,
It's just the precedent's been set. Yeah.
because it's good politics, terrible law.
You know, looking at it internationally, the United States has one of the highest, if not the highest, incarceration rates in the world. They've also got one of the worst crime rates.
Yeah.
It's not solving their problems for them.
Yeah, no, absolutely not. I want to go on to the detention as a last resort. Is there anything you want to touch on before we move on to that? I mean, we can bring it all together and talk about it afterwards.
Yeah, well, I think a prison can be like a university for crime. You send a child to prison, and they're going to come out with a bit more information.
PhD.
They're going to come out with a bit more information. So it's not always, it's good to have penalties, and we're talking about offences like murder and rape and kidnapping, and people need to be penalised for that. But you should also be aware that they're going to come out with a lot more knowledge and a few more contacts, and judges are aware of that, and that's something they should be aware of. So, when you're taken away as a last resort, perhaps it shouldn't be a last resort, but it should also be aware that it is not a solution to fixing somebody in their role in society.
No. So then when we talk about the concept of sentencing and one of the principles of youth justice and in the Juvenile Justice Act, it referred to the principle that detention is the last resort. Mm-hmm. So as of September last year, the government moved and amended the legislation and took that out of the legislation. So now, when you're dealing with children in sentencing, a judge or a magistrate can't consider a principle that detention should be a last resort. Shouldn't detention be a last resort in every situation? Like, shouldn't that be the final? Isn't that?
Yeah, you think, even though it is the last resort, if you're sending somebody for murder, you're going to get to that point when you're in the sentence. So it does. I would be interested to see the practical effect of it, of how many more children go to prison as a result of removing that.
What's your thoughts, David?
Yeah, I wonder whether I haven't heard anything from the courts as to how they interpret that. Even though the provision's been taken out, I suppose a sentencing magistrate or judge might nonetheless be able to think of that as a concept without contravening the law, even if it doesn't mandate it. But they do take those sorts of changes in legislation quite seriously, and they take the view that if that's what the legislature wants, then we're obliged to sort of comply with that, which means that we'll be more ready to impose a custodial sentence. It's kind of an admission of failure in the end, isn't it? Sure, we get to that point of failure instantaneously in the case of murder or something like that, but in other respects, it's an admission that we've run out of ideas on how to work with this child,
What ideas that score points politically?
Yeah. I want to talk about the politics of it at some stage tonight.
I look forward to that. Carl, do you have any view on that?
Nothing to add, really. I think that would be...
Yeah. Well, if you extend that, just that alone would be, in me, an egregious change to an act designed to reintegrate young people into the community as quickly as possible so that they don't have a life of crime. You don't want them to turn into adults. Now, research shows that the best way to do that is to keep them away from the criminal justice, to keep them away to do, to do community consultation,
like mediation.
Yeah, mediation to try and move them away from the court system and try and have better outcomes. But then to not only remove that principle, but then to remove the principle that a non-custodial order is better than detention in promoting a child's ability to reintegrate into the community. So they've removed out those words.
Yeah, which just seems self-evident. If it's very hard to reintegrate into the community if you're in prison.
Yeah. So what they're saying is that do not turn your mind as someone who's sentencing a child. That would be better for that child not to be incarcerated than to be reintegrated back into the community. That's been taken out. Now, that's extreme.
I wonder, I haven't gone back through the speeches in relation to those amendments, but I very much doubt anyone argued the point that you're making, which, did any politician in favour of this get up and say, I'm persuaded by all the evidence that it's better to reintegrate a child into society by keeping him in jail longer than by doing other things. I suspect no one ran that argument because it's an absurdity. But the end result plays well to the gallery, I suspect.
Yeah, and it seems almost superfluous that they made that, because they make the change that the sort of the interests of the victim come first, which would sort of trump all that anyway.
Yeah, and of course the victim should come.
Yeah, absolutely.
Come first.
Absolutely.
And some of these crimes aren't necessarily don't have victims, like the drug offences aren't. They're original offences now. They're offences against the king. Sorry, I know I'm speaking. You're not a monarchist, are you, David? But it's still. I just realised. Yeah, bring on the referendum. That's another story. But I guess from this is that, to me, that's another example of the parliament or the government trying to zip tie the sentencing judge or magistrate to their view. So they can't. So when you say they might turn their mind to it, they certainly can't refer to it in their remarks, can they? Because then that would be grounds for appeal, wouldn't it?
Well, it can be taken into account. Yes, that's true.
So if the sentence isn't strong enough, they said, well, I've turned my mind to these things, even though, but it's saying there, you can't consider that principle anymore because it's been removed.
Yeah.
So then here's my, and we've spoken about this previously before the podcast started, George, is that I'll play out a scenario. An adult encourages a young child to jump in the car and go for a joyride in a stolen vehicle. They crash, they try and escape, they get arrested by the police, and in that process, both are arrested for stealing a vehicle. Yep. So because they're both unlawful use of a motor vehicle or stealing a vehicle, they're both as guilty as each other. Now, shouldn't it be appropriate for a magistrate or a judge, in determining the guilt of the two people, to turn their mind to the fact that one's a child and one's an adult? One is leading and the other is being led. One is
like coercion.
Yeah. So by taking out those principles, don't you make it more difficult for those considerations to be given?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I would have thought so. Culpability is clearly different in that situation. So I guess the question is, are the courts going to be able to make that kind of distinction in terms of penalty, where leaving aside the language of the legislation, it's obvious that culpability is not equal between those two parties. Be interesting to see how the courts deal with that when they're confronted with it. I mean, the scientific and medical profession tell us that a child's brain isn't really mature. In the case of boys, till about 24. I think it's a bit younger in women because they're smarter. What's the criminal age of responsibility? Still at 10, is it?
10, unless you can prove 8, but 10 and 14. So you can you've got to prove criminal responsibility at 10, and at 14 it's proven.
It's assumed.
Yeah.
So it's kind of really putting a bit of a what's the word, a stranglehold or something on the professions that have to deal with this.
Carly, do you think it adequately deals with the fact that developing minds aren't contemplating adult crime for adult time?
I've got a 14-year-old, and he knows right from wrong, yes. But also, kids make decisions, they say things, do things that may not be in their character or may be just off the cuff because they're not mature enough. That's even like maybe talking back to a teacher or something, let alone a more serious crime, and if they're being, coerced or encouraged by older kids or adults. They don't have the family, they've come from a vulnerable background, they don't have the family values.
That vulnerable background is such a big issue.
It's massive.
Yeah, when, as I said, it's hard to contemplate these sentences or these penalties when you're hungry and you come from a violent home and you're not sure where you're going to be sleeping each night. And there are many kids there. So when you say $200,000 a year in incarcerating a child each year, that money's now not being able to be used to address those issues that create or are a petri dish for youth crime.
Couldn't we have spent 50 grand when he was 5 years old catching maybe whether it be like DV, drug use, family history of crime, neurodivergence, because a lot of these kids that come from vulnerable backgrounds probably don't get picked up. The parents don't have the resources for testing, etc. And the first time they ever experience some kind of insight into maybe neurodivergent issues or other mental health issues is when they get sent to the detention centre. And it's already too late. Well, it's not too late, but it's already come to a point where it's a serious problem. If they had been picked up when they were in early primary, maybe it would have cost the taxpayer $50,000 and not $200,000.
It's a lot less now that NDIS is getting cut in that area.
So, George, should detention be a last resort?
Not in the case of murder, kidnapping, rape. Generally, yes. For anybody, anywhere. But when it comes, I guess, this is a whole society-wide issue, and this legislation is only dealing with it at the very end, at the end of everything, at the end of a trial, and the judge is considering it. They should have a lot of different options, and to actually say that it isn't the last resort, or what is the last resort then? It shouldn't be the first thing.
Yeah.
So it's sort of, it's hard because, definitely if somebody murders somebody, they've got to go to jail. But the actual
if nothing else, to keep the rest of the community safe.
Yeah, but that is still as a last resort. You just go through everything first. That they no community service, no this, no that. It's jail. But it still is the last resort, I guess. You've just quickly gone through all the other options.
A close relative of mine used to work in police policy at a fairly high level, and he said to me once that it would be cheaper to send give all these kids a full scholarship to Brisbane Grammar than it is to keep them in youth detention.
Yeah.
Is that because Brisbane Grammar's not a very good school, or
no, it's because it's a very expensive one.
Yeah.
And I think there's a clue in that as to what the solution might be. If you need to keep people under control, call it incarceration if you like, then what you really should be trying to do is develop the kind of institutions where the period of residence in these institutions is designed to bring that kid up to speed, to give them the social skills, the work skills and so on, so that when they get out, they can cope. They're kids that, you outlined some of the disadvantages they have, and you've done a lot of work, and no doubt, in the court system. I've done a little bit. Some of these kids aren't very bright. They haven't really had opportunities. But if we were to think in terms of not jailing them so much as giving them involuntary residency in an institution where the primary objective is to improve their educational and social and work skills, I think we'd get better outcomes. You could sell that politically on the basis of, this is just a different type of jail. If that's the magic sort of thing, if incarceration is the magic sort of thing that gets you over the hurdle at election time, I think you could sell that. But I don't see any real, you're going to have to invest in a lot more teachers, social workers and so on within those institutions than I think is happening at the moment.
Well, an educated society is usually a happier society and a better functioning society. And my other thought about the education system in regards to it is it possible that if the education system had more flexible learning places for kids who don't necessarily fit into the mainstream schooling, would that help? Because maybe these kids don't fit into that.
Yeah, I mean, schooling is working hard, isn't it, to try and find a variety of different methods. Even in our own community, you've got, private schools to public schools with specialty areas to, like the likes of Glendine, to homeschooling, to unschooling. There's a range of things now. And I think those sorts of programs are significantly better than the punitive approach that this government is taking. I want to go to criminal history because in my mind, this is also one of the things I actually don't understand how it helps solve a youth crime crisis, and that is that a person's child criminal history, inclusive of police cautions, restorative justice agreements, and contraventions of a supervised release order, is admissible when the court is sentencing an adult for an offence.
Yeah. Well, again, it's assuming that the child is thinking that if I get charged and convicted of this, it's going to come back and burn me 15 years later in a different matter.
I have seen examples as in prosecutions. I have seen real life examples where young people have committed offences and they have stopped when they've hit 18 because of the idea of a clean slate. At a time where you have if you don't have a clean slate at 18, then maybe you'll keep offending till 21. But when you get told, now if you commit an offence, you're committing an adult offence, you have a clean slate starting now. All your youth crime is being put aside, and you've basically getting
a second chance.
You get a second chance, and you go. I can't comprehend any good reason why you would want to have a situation where you should declare a criminal history from a juvenile. I don't see any value in it whatsoever, unless it only relates to the penalty.
Yeah, because it would only relate to the penalty. Yeah, it's not going to go into the actual guilt of somebody. It's just going to be brought up in sentencing.
David, does this create a safer community?
Yeah, look, I wouldn't have thought so. I don't know. I haven't really turned my mind to it. I mean, there may be an argument for suggesting that history in relation to a serious offence as a child is relevant to sentencing an adult, because that's what we're talking about, aren't we?
Like a string of arson. A string of arson throughout your teens, and then you get charged with arson in your 20s.
Yeah. I mean, I would have thought that's an argument for wanting some psychologist intervention rather than some prison warders intervention. But yeah, that sort of thing, it might be relevant, but more minor stuff seems to be silly.
Yeah, but if we accept that juveniles make decisions that aren't always the best for themselves or their families or their communities, and that at some point they grow up, if they're going to commit offences as adults, they're going to be dealt with through the criminal justice system regardless. Simply because you want to be able to refer to criminal history because it's going to get you a better penalty doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good outcome for the community, I would think. Yeah.
And an 18-year-old as well has the opportunity to also have a clean start, taking away the criminal history, a clean start by being more independent away from their family, and maybe that is part of the causation of the issues that they've had up until that point as well.
I mean, even when Fitzgerald made the determination or the recommendation that in some cases criminal history not be recorded. It was a massive step for and people could argue, well, shouldn't it be recorded? But there was an argument, and I think a rational argument, that said if some people commit offences and it's their first offence, then by not recording a conviction, you're giving them the motivation to keep their criminal history in check, to keep their keep the slate clean.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same with juveniles.
Yeah, because I guess all we're talking about here is sentencing. We're not talking about increasing police resources. The legislation doesn't deal with, any of that. This is about what judges are doing at the end. And and all of it should be about trying to get people on the right side of society and law abiding, and to allow to have somebody's, what they did as a 14-year-old continue with them for the rest of their lives doesn't help them be on the right side. If anything, it keeps them in sort of in the criminal world.
Like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking about that police intervention and that part before. I do note that the state government came out and said that the number of victims has decreased by 6.3%, and I thought that was a really nuanced statement. Firstly, it was from January to September of 1 year; it wasn't a full year. And secondly, it said the number of victims.
Yeah, not offences, not offenders.
Not offences, not offenders. And the reason you would say that is because
you're cherry picking statistics.
Yeah, you're trying to find. I mean, some could argue that one is, the more police resources you have, the more crimes will be reported. So just because less crimes might have been reported by victims doesn't necessarily mean that the outcomes have been achieved, do they?
Well, there's a 90% reoffending rate of kids coming out of the detention centres. That's what I read today.
90%, that's a lot.
That's
in
a
Queensland,
serious indication that
in Queensland.
that system isn't working, isn't it? I mean, one of the things that's always concerned me is that we're starting this discussion after the kid's been arrested. There's a whole history before that led to that point, and I don't see anything in what the this or really any other government is doing to address those sorts of issues. I think the indicia that suggest that a kid may be at risk of offending later on is pretty well known. It's lack of a father or family friction, that sort of stuff, homelessness, economic disadvantage.
Fetal alcohol syndrome is big in Queensland.
That's right. There's a whole pile of reasons. Now, it's long been my view that effective parenting programs should be for everybody. Not just pick out the cohort that you think are going to be the ones who'll have a problem, because that will tend to stigmatise them. But if it just becomes as natural as going to hospital to have a child, which most people still do, if it becomes as natural as that to do appropriate parenting programs, so that mothers and fathers learn what it is they need to do to give their child the best chance. Now, you won't pick up everybody, but you'll pick up a lot more than you're doing when you're not doing anything. But that comes back to this old problem of money. If you keep spending another $1 billion on another detention centre, you're not going to have the money to put those programs in place. And so you'll just perpetuate the problem.
So then you've got the cycle, parent to child, child to their child.
So in dealing with this piece of legislation or the legislative changes that this bill brought in, they had to turn their mind to the Human Rights Human Rights Act and whether it infringed on it. Often, and we mentioned last week, often legislation is changed and it's a cursory consideration for human rights. If you squint properly, turn it upside down, somehow it doesn't infringe on human rights. And I have a view that potentially a lot of legislation is a violation of people's human rights, but that's for another discussion. But I do want to read out what the legislation allows. So this is what they're doing when they're overriding the Human Rights Act. So it says in Section 1 of 43, subsection 1 of the Human Rights Act, Parliament may expressly declare in an act that the act or another act or a provision of the act or another act has effect despite being incompatible with one or more human rights or despite anything else in this act. It is the intention of Parliament that an override declaration will only be made in exceptional circumstances, which is war, state of an emergency, an exceptional crisis situation, constituting a threat to public safety, health, or order. Now, so it is accepted by the state government that this is stepping outside the bounds of the Human Rights Act, and that it is warranted because there is they say a crisis, but this refers to an exceptional crisis situation. Many of the people who provided submissions, experts in the field, have suggested that youth crime has reduced in the last 10 years, not increased.
It's pretty well accepted, I think.
So how is this? Firstly, is it appropriate that a state government should override human rights in order to achieve an outcome as such as this, in your mind?
One of the problems with that, when you put it that way, of course, is that it's hard to see how it could be exceptional. Youth crime, constituting a threat to public safety, etc., has been with us forever. So it's not exceptional. If the level of it is reducing, it's even less likely that you can call it exceptional. So I think it's a Trumpian sort of way of
loopholes.
Just trying to grab a few convenient words to hang your hat on.
Because in dealing with that, you're right, the exceptional circumstance can only last for no longer than 5 years. So if it's 5 years, what happens after the 5 years? Once you've done this adult crime, adult time, you've breached the Human Rights Act, you have to revert back to the status quo. Like, what happens after 5 years?
I'd never turn my mind to that point, I must say.
The only way you can fix this is they will have to go and change the Human Rights Act. They'll have to change Section 43 so that they can breach or override the Human Rights Act
indefinitely.
Not an exceptional, just in any circumstance, in crisis situations, So for me, that is a real significant issue, and it's something that's becoming, in my mind, pervasive in law, because people who need to get voted in to do their jobs are making the laws and ignoring the scholarly lawmakers or the societies that are designed. When you have, so this is in relation to this law, the United Nations has condemned this. The Law Society has condemned this. The Youth Advocacy Centre has condemned it. And nearly every professional that I've read anything on that has a youth justice or restorative justice approach has condemned this. They say this does not work.
Yeah. And I guess the difference between us and the US, say, here we have the Human Rights Act. In the US, you have the Bill of Rights. And so, the Human Rights Act is a piece of legislation by a unicameral parliament that can be overridden. In the US, the right to bear arms, created, centuries ago, now totally confines US societies, and people can't democratically change that. Their elected representatives can't change that. I think it is better that ultimately the power rests in the parliament, and they can override previous acts, and they don't have something like, a right to bear arms, mandating that people can walk around with machine guns.
So you see a reason why there should be a right to override the Human Rights Act.
Yeah. I think America is a good case in why a Bill of Rights, which restricts the ability of legislatures to respond to public concerns, is a problem. In America, they cannot get rid of gun culture because of a Bill of Rights. If it was just in a piece of legislation, they could. Yeah,
and so do you think that then in this situation, it meets the standard of exceptional crisis situation for youth crime?
It would be difficult to argue that. You'd have to say that whilst the numbers are technically gone down, I think it's going down from something like 3,000 per 100,000, in terms of offenders, in 2008 to 2,000 now. So the numbers are generally trending down, but I think society is generally taking a more serious look at younger generation. That's why, it's a pretty big deal what's happening next week with social media. We do need to do something. to recognise that, you know, as a society, we have to look after and shepherd. And this is what the Human Rights Act is actually about. It's about, you know, shepherding and making sure you're caring for the children and making sure they are going from this awkward stage of childhood into adulthood. And perhaps it is a crisis that we have murders being done by children who should be watching cartoons. But it's not an escalating crisis. I mean,
No.
the numbers don't support that.
Yep.
The numbers don't support
Well,
that.
a couple of things I read today were that there aren't more kids committing the crimes. The crimes are actually by a smaller group of kids that the crimes are escalating in their severity and the reoffending. So there aren't more kids committing crimes. In fact, kids are generally less violent. It's just that smaller cohort are becoming more violent. I also read that there was a crime peak in the 90s and there was a little bit again at COVID, and it's been slowly dropping since then. And to me, I feel like there are lots of social aspects that aren't, I guess, discussed or looked at widely that can cause issues like that, freakonomics type things. And like, for example, like the baby bonus, it started in 2004. The crime peak started around about COVID 2020. Like, what kind of links are made through, whether it be political decisions or...
Well, Occam's razor would suggest that the simplest explanation is the right one, and to my mind, in the 90s was Goldstein's principles of proactive policing were adopted across, 1990. It changed from a police force to a police service. They had community police officers. They had integration into the community of police officers. They worked hard in schools.
Yep.
The concept of being proactive as a police officer rather than reactive as a police officer was the fundamental principles of policing.
It was like the heyday of PCYCs too. PCYCs now are really after-school care centres. They're not what they were.
So I could argue that is the fundamental change that saw great outcomes. And this, if you read, the Youth Advocacy Centre says there is no data to justify the proposed override of children's rights. And then Dixon, who did an article called Punitive Populism and the Politicisation of Youth Crime in Queensland, that says that youth crime is construed as a crisis to justify punitive intentions. And that to me is what it comes down to. And my question is there a risk that we are trading long-term safety for short-term political satisfaction?
I think that's undoubtedly the case, and I think it's been the case for a long time. I mean, there'll be perhaps among the lovely audience we have, there'll be people out there saying, but you're not talking about the victims.
Yeah.
But in a sense, we are talking about the victims because putting policies in place which are making the problem worse just means we're lining up more victims for the future. So it's not a question of ignoring the victims and being soft on the perpetrators. It's really a case of saying, the best outcome for the perpetrators is obviously to make sure they don't become perpetrators. But in broad terms, the best outcome for children committing or at risk of committing youth crime is also the best outcome for the victims, because you're going to reduce the overall level of offending. In those circumstances, I think we need to be able to concentrate on what works best, and what works best isn't necessarily what's going to be popular with the community. There was an article, might have been the one you sent around, where they were talking about there's a sort of a circularity about the public being anxious, newspapers concentrating on journalism that deals with crime. That makes the public more anxious. The politicians react to it. The politicians who react to it tend to get a better, vote outcome and so on. And so it just tends to be a reinforcing circle. I was fascinated, if I could just touch on this, I was fascinated with the Hinchinbrook by-election, where the LNP recovered the seat from Caddis Party last weekend. And Chris Afulli immediately said, this justifies the strong position we've taken on crime, and therefore will we'll make even more amendments to the Bail Act so that any breach of bail will see you go directly to jail without your $200. The problem with that is, and the flaw in that is that he's not responding to better information or more expert advice on what will work. He's responding to what will make him more popular. He's responding to what will win him more votes. Now, it may be a policy can be right, even though it wins you more votes, but winning you more votes is not a ground on which you should justify your policy because it proves nothing at all.
Except you have a mandate.
Yes, but having a mandate, it seems to me having a mandate is not really a justification for doing the wrong thing.
Yeah.
So the mandate is to fix it.
In the more broad sense, that's right. Yeah.
Final thoughts. We reached the end of our. We're a few minutes over. So, George, final thoughts on this issue?
Yeah, I'd like to see the information over as it comes out in terms of where this does lead with the crime rate and the number of young people who are in prison, because they're very full at the moment, the youth detention centres. So, I think we'll get more and more data over the next year about what has been the result of this legislation and how successful it has been at its intention.
David?
Yeah, look, I think that's really important, and I think it's going to be really important if that data includes the cost, just how much extra money is being spent on correctional services and so on, and how much is being spent on other youth support services.
Carly?
I don't know. I feel like if there would have been an easy answer to all of it, we would have come up with it and done it by now. But I feel like this isn't the answer.
Absolutely. So from my point of view is that if you look at it from a perspective of a state government, I actually think David Crisafulli and his leadership has been quite effective in like if you have a textbook on how effective a government's been in their first part of their term, I think he's done really well. I think he's engaged with his community. I think he's done a lot of things right. He will look at this and say he's doing the right thing because the people are following him. I believe in time, whether it be 5 years or 10 years, we'll look at this legislation and we'll look at these decisions as being some of the worst decisions that have been made by this government or any government that I've bear witness to. I think it's terrible legislation. That's just my personal view, and it doesn't reflect the view of you guys. I understand that, but I certainly think that in time we'll see that this will not work. It cannot work. George, next week, can we talk about we talk about the Torquay Caravan Park, or do you want to quickly give us a...
Yeah, it won't be Thursday night, though. I'm not available Thursday night. But if you tune in on Wednesday morning, you can watch the council meeting when we have the vote on the Torquay Caravan Park, settling about a year and a bit's worth of debate.
So give us a rundown on what the why it's taken a year and what the issues were.
Well, it took a long time to get the plans together to put out for consultation, and the wheels of council move very slowly generally. But certainly the consultation was out for a whole month, and we've had 4,600 and something full submissions, and it took a little while to put in a submission. Did any of you do it? I
started doing it.
See, so 4,600 people did the whole thing. A few people dropped out, and that's something we have to learn from. So that's the biggest one we've ever done. Earlier in the year, we did a survey about whether we should have a cemetery in Harvey Bay or make people who want to be buried go to Maryborough. And we thought we'd get a lot with that, and that was about 400. But one thing we did with that was give a 2-minute option, a 10-minute option, or a 20-minute option in terms of how long the survey takes. And this time we just had a 45-minute option. And a few people dropped out.
What was the outcome of that?
Nothing clear. Clear as mud.
Okay.
It's still a decision that we'll have to make about, whether we do build another cemetery in Harvey Bay.
Yeah. You opened a natural one or something.
Yeah, we did, but that doesn't have a lot of plots. So we have a natural cemetery at Aalborg. Well, it's Nickenbaugh. It's next to the Aalborg Cemetery. Yeah. Okay. The Danish cemetery. Yeah.
All right, guys, that's it. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Who Gives a Vote.
Thank you.